They thought the most invisible person in the room was the woman carrying the silver tray, but before the night ended she would be the only one brave enough to see the child everyone else pretended not to notice. The Moretti estate glowed like a palace on the hill that evening, its tall windows pouring warm golden light across the long marble driveway while black cars arrived one after another, doors opening to release men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns that caught the chandelier light like tiny constellations. Inside, the grand ballroom hummed with the careful music of wealth, crystal glasses clinking softly, polished shoes sliding across the glossy floor, the low murmur of business deals disguised as polite conversation. Everything about the evening was precise, elegant, controlled. Naomi Carter moved quietly through that world with a silver tray balanced in steady hands, the faint scent of citrus polish and fresh linen following her as she passed from one cluster of guests to another. She had learned quickly that in houses like this, invisibility was part of the job. If she walked softly enough, spoke only when spoken to, and kept her eyes lowered just enough to seem respectful, people stopped noticing she was there at all. It was safer that way. Invisible people heard everything, saw everything, and were rarely blamed for anything. Still, even invisibility had limits, and Naomi felt that limit the moment her eyes drifted toward the far edge of the ballroom. Near the polished oak doors that opened to the terrace stood a small boy no one seemed to approach. Ethan Moretti was only 9 years old, but tonight he looked even smaller, his slim shoulders drawn inward as though he were trying to disappear inside his dark blue jacket. While the other guests laughed and raised their glasses, Ethan stared at the floor, rocking gently from heel to toe in a quiet rhythm only he seemed to understand. A pair of teenagers from one of the visiting families glanced at him, whispered something behind their hands, and quickly looked away. One of the mothers placed a guiding hand on her daughter's shoulder and steered her toward the dessert table instead, her smile polite but unmistakably cautious. Naomi had seen that expression before. It was the look people wore when they did not know how to handle difference and decided it was easier to pretend it wasn't there. The orchestra in the corner began a soft instrumental version of an old jazz standard, the slow rhythm echoing gently through the ballroom's high ceilings. To most of the guests it was just background music, but Naomi noticed how Ethan flinched at the sudden swell of sound, his hands rising halfway toward his ears before he forced them back down again. He took a small step backward until his shoulders brushed the wall, eyes darting across the room as if the lights were too bright or the air itself had become too loud. Naomi shifted her tray slightly, pretending to adjust the glasses as she watched. No one else seemed to notice. Across the room, Adrian Moretti stood surrounded by several investors and a city councilman, his presence commanding the center of the ballroom the way a lighthouse dominates a harbor. Tall, composed, and dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with quiet precision, he listened to a guest with a calm, unreadable expression. Every few seconds, though, his gaze flicked briefly toward the edge of the room where his son stood. It was a glance most people would miss, but Naomi saw the tightness in his jaw each time it happened. Power could command many things, she thought, but it could not always protect the people who mattered most. The tray in her hand suddenly felt heavier as she watched Ethan shift again, the soft rocking growing faster now, his fingers twisting nervously in the fabric of his sleeve. Someone brushed past him without looking, their perfume sharp in the air, and Ethan pressed closer to the wall as though trying to escape a storm only he could feel. Naomi inhaled slowly, steadying herself the way she always did before making a decision that might cost her more than it should. The house rules were clear. Staff were not supposed to approach the young master unless instructed. They were certainly not supposed to interrupt the flow of a formal event hosted by Adrian Moretti himself. But as Naomi looked around the room, she realized something that settled heavily in her chest. In a ballroom filled with more than 100 successful, well-dressed adults, not one person had walked over to ask the boy if he was okay. And sometimes the difference between a room full of people and a room full of kindness was just one person willing to step forward. Naomi lowered the tray onto a nearby table, the quiet click of silver against glass almost lost beneath the music, and turned slowly toward the lonely figure by the wall. Naomi Carter had worked in the Moretti estate long enough to understand the silent rules that governed a place like this, rules that were never written on paper but were enforced through glances, posture, and the careful distance staff kept from the lives of the powerful people they served. The first rule was simple: do your job well and remain unseen. The second rule was even simpler: do not interfere. Yet as Naomi stepped away from the table where she had placed her tray, she could feel the quiet tension in her chest that came when the heart and the rules began to pull in different directions. The orchestra continued its smooth melody, a gentle rhythm drifting across the polished ballroom floor while couples moved slowly beneath the warm glow of chandeliers that hung nearly 20 feet above them. Laughter rose and faded like waves in the background, conversations about investments, real estate, and upcoming charity projects filling the air with the polite language of wealth. But near the tall oak doors, Ethan Moretti remained in his small corner of stillness, separated from the rest of the room by something invisible but unmistakable. Naomi approached slowly, not wanting to startle him, her steps quiet against the marble floor. She had learned long ago that some children felt the world differently, that lights could feel brighter than they were, sounds louder than anyone else noticed, and the movement of people around them could feel like standing in the middle of a rushing crowd even when the room appeared calm. As she drew closer, she noticed the details others overlooked. Ethan's fingers were pressed tightly against the seam of his sleeve, twisting the fabric in small, repetitive motions. His eyes moved quickly from the chandelier to the floor, then toward the orchestra before darting away again as though each new sound landed too sharply in his mind. He was trying very hard to stay calm. Naomi recognized the effort immediately. She had seen it before years ago when her younger brother Marcus would sit in the corner of their small living room in Cleveland, rocking gently while the television played too loudly and neighbors argued in the hallway outside their apartment. Marcus had always said the world felt like too many radios playing at once. Looking at Ethan now, Naomi felt the same quiet understanding settle in her chest. She stopped several feet away from him, lowering herself slightly so she was not standing over him, careful to remain within his view without stepping too close. Ethan noticed her movement almost immediately. His head turned just a little, dark eyes studying her face with cautious curiosity. Naomi did not speak right away. Instead, she allowed the silence to exist for a moment, the way someone might wait before entering a room that belongs to someone else. Across the ballroom, a burst of laughter erupted near the bar as a group of guests toasted something none of the staff had been invited to understand. The sound carried across the marble like a sudden wave, and Ethan flinched again, shoulders tightening. Naomi saw the reaction and softened her voice before she finally spoke. "Hello, Ethan." Her tone was gentle, steady, the same calm rhythm she used when speaking to nervous children at the community center where she had volunteered years earlier. Ethan did not answer, but his rocking slowed slightly. Naomi noticed something else too. His gaze flicked past her shoulder toward the center of the ballroom where the dance floor shimmered beneath the chandeliers. A few couples had begun to move together now, their steps slow and elegant as the orchestra shifted into a slightly brighter melody. Naomi followed his gaze and then looked back at him, understanding forming quietly in her mind. Sometimes children like Ethan did not want the music to stop. Sometimes they only needed someone willing to meet the music with them. Before she could say anything else, a voice spoke behind her, low and sharp with quiet authority. "Miss Carter." Naomi turned her head just enough to see Mr. Davenport, the head house manager, standing several yards away with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression remained composed, but his eyes carried the warning she expected. "Staff were not meant to linger here." Naomi nodded respectfully, acknowledging that she had heard him, but she did not step away. For a brief moment Mr. Davenport seemed ready to walk closer and repeat the instruction more directly. Then something unusual happened. From across the ballroom, Adrian Moretti's gaze shifted again toward the corner where Naomi and Ethan stood. The powerful man paused in the middle of a sentence with one of his guests, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the quiet interaction unfolding near the wall. Mr. Davenport followed that gaze and immediately straightened his posture, deciding without another word that interrupting the moment might not be the wisest choice. Naomi did not notice any of this. Her attention remained on Ethan, whose eyes had returned to the dance floor where the music now carried a soft, hopeful rhythm. The boy's rocking had slowed to a gentle sway, almost like he was feeling the music inside his chest rather than hearing it through the crowded room. Naomi felt a small smile form as she studied him. Then, with the kind of simple courage that rarely made headlines but often changed lives, she took one quiet step closer and asked a question no one else in that ballroom had thought to ask. Naomi Carter watched Ethan for a moment longer before speaking, giving the quiet space between them time to settle the way still water settles after a stone has been dropped into it. The orchestra continued playing its smooth melody, the slow swing rhythm gliding through the ballroom like warm air drifting through an open window, but here near the wall the sound felt softer, less overwhelming. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the dance floor where several couples moved in gentle circles beneath the chandelier light, their polished shoes sliding across the marble in careful rhythm. Naomi noticed the way his shoulders moved slightly with the music, a tiny sway that matched the tempo almost perfectly even though he did not step forward. It was the kind of movement most people would miss because they were not looking closely enough to see it. Naomi leaned forward just a little so her voice would not have to compete with the room. "Would you show me how you dance when nobody is watching?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them like a soft thread. Ethan blinked slowly and looked up at her face, searching it with careful attention as though he was measuring something he could not explain. For a moment he did not move at all. Naomi remained still, hands relaxed at her sides, letting him decide what would happen next. Across the ballroom, the conversations continued. Glasses clinked together, and laughter rippled through the crowd in warm waves, but here in this small corner the world felt strangely calm. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Naomi noticed the way the rhythm of his rocking aligned with the music drifting from the orchestra. She smiled gently. "That looks like dancing to me," she said softly. Ethan's eyes flickered again toward the dance floor and then back to Naomi. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted one hand a few inches and moved it in a small arc that matched the rhythm of the song. Naomi did not laugh or react with surprise. Instead she mirrored the motion in a way so subtle that it almost looked accidental, lifting her own hand and letting it follow the same gentle pattern. The effect was immediate. Ethan's eyes widened slightly as he noticed the reflection of his movement. He studied her face again, perhaps making sure she was not teasing him, and when he saw only calm encouragement there he let his shoulders loosen a little more. Naomi shifted her weight to the side, allowing the music to guide the movement of her feet in a slow, relaxed sway. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. Just the kind of simple motion that belongs to the music itself. Ethan watched carefully, his rocking slowing until it matched the rhythm she had created. Around them, the party continued with its quiet elegance. A group of investors near the bar leaned closer together discussing something about a new property development. A pair of older guests laughed warmly while examining photographs on a phone. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water, glancing briefly toward Naomi before continuing on. But the attention of one man in the room had shifted completely. Adrian Moretti had fallen silent in the middle of a conversation he was having with the city councilman. His dark eyes were now focused entirely on the far corner of the ballroom where his son stood beside the woman who had stepped out of the staff line. The councilman continued speaking for a few seconds before realizing the powerful man was no longer listening. Adrian did not answer. He was watching Ethan. Watching the way the boy's hands had stopped twisting the fabric of his sleeve. Watching the way the small, anxious rocking had turned into something smoother, something closer to the rhythm of the music. For the first time since the evening began, Ethan did not look like a child trying to disappear. He looked like a child listening. Back in the corner of the room, Naomi took a small step backward and lifted her hand slightly in invitation. Not toward the crowded dance floor where the lights were bright and the music louder, but toward a quiet patch of marble where the music felt softer. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. The movement was careful, as though he was testing whether the floor itself might react differently once he left the wall. Naomi moved with him, keeping the same gentle rhythm so the world around him would not feel too fast. For several seconds they simply stood there, swaying lightly to the music. Ethan's gaze dropped to his shoes and then rose again to Naomi's face, and something new appeared in his expression. It was not a full smile. Not yet. But it was the beginning of one. Across the ballroom, Adrian Moretti took a slow breath and felt something unfamiliar shift quietly inside his chest. Because in a room filled with wealth, influence, and polished perfection, the most remarkable thing happening that night was a small dance no one had planned. The music drifted gently through the ballroom as Naomi Carter continued to move in that quiet rhythm beside Ethan, careful not to rush him, careful not to change the tempo that had finally begun to settle his breathing. The chandeliers above them cast warm golden reflections across the polished marble floor, and for a moment the enormous room seemed to soften around the small circle they had created. Ethan's steps were not like the smooth movements of the couples dancing at the center of the floor. His motions were smaller, thoughtful, almost like he was testing the space with each shift of his feet. But Naomi did not try to correct him or guide him somewhere else. Instead she followed his rhythm exactly, letting the music belong to him rather than asking him to follow the music. Ethan noticed that. The slight tension in his shoulders loosened a little more as he watched her mirror his movements. When he lifted his hand again, Naomi lifted hers the same way. When he swayed to the right, she did the same. Slowly the nervous motion that had once been rocking against the wall began to look more and more like a dance that only the two of them understood. Several guests nearby had begun to notice. At first it was only a glance or two, quick looks from people passing with drinks in their hands, but curiosity spreads quickly in rooms filled with observant people. One woman in a silver dress paused mid-conversation and turned slightly toward the corner. A man near the bar leaned closer to see what had captured her attention. Their voices lowered, their eyes focusing on the quiet moment unfolding where no one had expected anything unusual to happen. Still, no one stepped forward. The crowd remained at a respectful distance, unsure how to react to something so simple and yet so unfamiliar in a room that usually operated on carefully rehearsed social rules. Across the ballroom, Adrian Moretti remained still, his attention fixed on his son. The city councilman beside him had stopped speaking entirely now, sensing that the powerful man's mind had moved somewhere else. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but inside him something complicated was shifting. For years he had built an empire by controlling outcomes, anticipating problems, and removing obstacles before they had time to grow. Yet here was a moment he had never been able to create for his own child. Ethan had been surrounded by specialists, therapists, private tutors, and carefully structured routines designed by the best experts money could find. They had all tried to help him navigate the world. And still there had always been evenings like this one, moments when the crowded noise of life closed in around him and he withdrew behind that quiet wall no one else could cross. Until tonight. Adrian watched as Ethan took another small step away from the wall. It was only about 2 feet, but the distance felt enormous. Naomi noticed the movement too. She kept her voice soft and steady. "You are doing great," she said gently. Ethan did not answer with words, but his eyes flickered upward toward her again. There was curiosity in them now, replacing some of the uncertainty that had filled them earlier. Naomi nodded slightly toward the music drifting through the room. "That song has a nice rhythm," she said. "It feels like the kind of music that likes slow steps." Ethan tilted his head, listening carefully as if hearing the music differently than the rest of the room. Then he lifted both hands this time, moving them slightly as though tracing the shape of the melody in the air. Naomi followed the movement again, matching his pattern so perfectly that anyone watching might have thought they had practiced together before the party even began. The orchestra continued its gentle performance without realizing that their quiet jazz tune had become the center of something far more meaningful than background entertainment. Around them the ballroom seemed to grow quieter, conversations fading as more guests began to notice the unexpected dance happening near the edge of the room. Even the waitstaff slowed their steps slightly as they passed, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had formed. Ethan took another step, this time a little more confidently, and the beginning of that almost smile returned to his face. Naomi saw it and felt warmth spread through her chest. She did not celebrate the moment out loud. She simply kept moving with him, steady and patient. Because sometimes the most important victories in a child's world were not loud at all. Sometimes they looked exactly like this. A small boy who had felt lost in a crowded room now standing in the center of his own quiet rhythm, with someone beside him who understood that the bravest thing he had done all evening was simply step forward. The music continued to flow through the ballroom like a calm river, steady and warm beneath the chandelier lights, and Naomi Carter remained beside Ethan, moving with the same quiet rhythm that had slowly drawn him out from the wall. By now they had drifted several feet from the corner, not into the center of the dance floor but into a soft edge of space where the light felt less overwhelming and the sound carried gently rather than crashing around him. Ethan's movements were still careful, but there was something new in the way he stepped. The hesitation had begun to fade, replaced by curiosity. His hands lifted again, tracing the invisible shape of the melody in the air, and Naomi mirrored him with patient precision, allowing him to lead the pace of their small dance. Around them the atmosphere of the ballroom had shifted in a way that no one could quite explain. Guests who had once been absorbed in their own conversations now found their attention drifting toward the quiet scene unfolding near the edge of the room. A woman holding a glass of sparkling water lowered it slowly, her eyes softening as she watched the boy move. A couple near the orchestra paused in the middle of their conversation, their voices fading as the significance of the moment began to settle over the crowd. No one applauded. No one interrupted. Instead the room seemed to breathe more slowly, as if everyone instinctively understood that something delicate was happening and that the smallest disruption might break it. Naomi noticed the change but did not look away from Ethan. Her focus remained entirely on him, because she knew how quickly confidence could vanish if a child suddenly felt the weight of too many eyes. So she kept her voice low and warm, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "The music is kind tonight," she said gently. "It is not rushing us." Ethan tilted his head slightly as if considering that idea. Then he surprised her. Instead of simply swaying, he took a small step forward and turned halfway in a slow circle, his shoes gliding across the marble floor with cautious determination. It was not the kind of spin one learned in formal dance lessons. It was something entirely his own, a movement guided by instinct rather than training. Naomi followed the turn, letting her own step match his timing exactly. When he stopped, she stopped. When he lifted his hand again, she lifted hers in the same quiet arc. Ethan's eyes widened just a little, and for the first time a genuine smile flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable. Naomi saw it and felt a warmth spread through her chest. She did not celebrate the moment out loud. Instead she nodded gently as though this small victory was the most natural thing in the world. Because for Ethan, it needed to feel exactly that way. Across the ballroom Adrian Moretti had taken a slow step away from the group of guests who had surrounded him earlier. He had not announced his movement and no one tried to stop him. The councilman simply watched in silence as the powerful man began walking toward the edge of the room. Adrian's expression remained calm, but inside his mind memories were surfacing that he had not allowed himself to linger on for years. He remembered the first time Ethan had become overwhelmed at a crowded family gathering when he was 4 years old. He remembered the confusion on relatives' faces when the boy covered his ears and hid beneath the dining table. He remembered the careful explanations from doctors and specialists, the long meetings about sensory sensitivity and emotional processing. And he remembered the quiet fear that followed him after each conversation, the fear that his son might spend a lifetime standing just outside the world everyone else seemed to enter so easily. Yet now, as Adrian watched Naomi and Ethan move together in that gentle rhythm, he saw something he had rarely witnessed before. Ethan was not withdrawing. He was stepping forward. Naomi noticed Adrian approaching only when he had come within several yards of them. She did not stop dancing. She simply glanced toward him briefly, acknowledging his presence with a respectful nod before returning her attention to Ethan. Adrian paused there, allowing the moment to continue without interruption. The orchestra reached the final notes of the song, the melody stretching softly into the air before fading into silence. For a second the room remained completely still. Ethan looked up at Naomi again, his breathing calm, his shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been when the evening began. Naomi lowered her hand slowly and smiled at him. "That was a beautiful dance," she said softly. Ethan looked down at his shoes, then back at her, and gave a small nod as though he had just discovered something new about himself. And standing only a few steps away, Adrian Moretti realized that the quiet courage of one woman had given his son something priceless that no amount of wealth had ever been able to provide before, the feeling that the world might finally have space for him after all. For several seconds after the music ended, the ballroom remained unusually quiet, as though the entire room had forgotten what it had been doing before the small dance began. Naomi Carter stood beside Ethan with the same calm patience she had shown since the moment she approached him, her posture relaxed and unhurried so the sudden silence would not feel like pressure. Ethan's breathing remained steady, his eyes moving slowly across the room as he processed the change around him. Moments earlier the music had carried him, the rhythm guiding his steps and filling the air with a gentle structure he could follow. Now that the orchestra had paused, the sounds of the room returned gradually like distant waves rolling back toward shore. Glasses clinked again. A quiet conversation resumed near the bar. Someone laughed softly across the ballroom, though the laughter sounded more subdued than before. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, but this time the movement was not anxious. It was thoughtful, as if he was deciding what to do next. Naomi noticed the difference immediately. She crouched just a little so her voice would remain at the same level as his. "That was a very good dance," she said again with the same gentle warmth. Ethan looked at her for a moment, studying her face carefully. Then he surprised her by speaking in a quiet voice that had barely been heard in the ballroom all evening. "The music was easier here," he said slowly. Naomi nodded with quiet understanding. "Yes," she replied. "Sometimes music feels different depending on where we stand." Ethan looked down at the marble floor again, then toward the center of the ballroom where several guests had now begun to move back toward their conversations. The space that had briefly belonged to their quiet moment was returning to its original purpose. Yet something about the room had changed. People were still watching, though now they tried to do so politely. Naomi could feel the attention, but she kept her focus on Ethan so he would not feel it too strongly. A few steps away, Adrian Moretti remained standing exactly where he had stopped when the music faded. From this distance he could see his son clearly, the small smile still lingering faintly at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Adrian felt a deep breath rise in his chest, one he had not realized he had been holding. For years he had watched Ethan navigate crowded spaces with careful effort, always aware of how easily noise and attention could overwhelm him. The specialists had explained the patterns, the sensory challenges, the strategies that might help. Adrian had listened to all of them. He had followed every recommendation with the same determination that had built his success in business. Yet the moment he was witnessing now had not come from a report or a treatment plan. It had come from a simple act of understanding. Adrian stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle Ethan or interrupt the calm that had formed around him. Naomi noticed the movement immediately and rose to her feet again. When Adrian reached them he paused, his presence tall and composed but his voice quieter than most people in the room had ever heard it. Ethan looked up at his father. For a second the boy seemed uncertain whether he had done something wrong by stepping away from the wall earlier. Adrian saw the hesitation and softened his tone. "That looked like a good dance," he said gently. Ethan studied his father's face, searching for signs of disappointment or correction. Finding none, he nodded once in quiet agreement. Naomi watched the exchange with respectful silence. Adrian turned his attention toward her then. Up close the powerful presence that had commanded the entire ballroom earlier now carried something more complicated beneath it. Gratitude. Curiosity. Perhaps even relief. "You are Naomi," he said calmly. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Adrian glanced briefly toward Ethan again, then back at her. "Thank you for noticing him." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried weight. Naomi shook her head slightly, her voice soft but steady. "He just needed someone to listen to the music with him," she replied. Ethan looked between the two adults, quietly observing the conversation. Then, with the same cautious confidence he had shown on the dance floor, he stepped a little closer to his father. The movement was small, only about 1 foot across the marble, but Adrian felt its significance immediately. He rested a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, careful not to overwhelm him with sudden contact. The orchestra began preparing for the next song, instruments shifting softly in the background. As the musicians lifted their bows and adjusted their sheet music, Adrian realized that the evening he had carefully planned for months had become memorable for a reason he had never expected. Not because of the guests. Not because of the speeches. But because one quiet woman had seen what everyone else had missed, and in doing so had changed the atmosphere of the entire room. The orchestra lifted their instruments again and the next melody began to rise slowly through the ballroom, softer than the one before, almost as if the musicians themselves sensed that the evening had shifted into a gentler mood. The warm sound of a saxophone drifted across the marble floor while the chandeliers above continued casting long golden reflections that moved like quiet ripples with every step taken by the guests. Adrian Moretti remained beside Ethan, his hand still resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, careful not to press too firmly. Ethan looked up at him for a moment, then back toward Naomi Carter, who stood a respectful distance away now that the conversation between father and son had begun. Naomi kept her posture calm and composed, her hands folded lightly in front of her as she allowed the moment to belong to them. Across the room the party slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, though many voices carried a new tone of quiet reflection. Several guests who had witnessed the dance earlier now glanced toward Ethan with expressions that were softer than before. A woman in a pale blue gown leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made him nod thoughtfully instead of laughing as he had earlier in the evening. The atmosphere of the room had changed in a way that no formal announcement could have achieved. Ethan listened to the music again, the gentle rhythm guiding the small sway of his shoulders. Adrian noticed the movement and spoke quietly. "Do you want to stay here for a moment, or would you like to sit by the terrace where it is a little quieter?" Ethan considered the question carefully. His eyes moved toward the tall glass doors that opened to the outdoor terrace where the night air waited beyond the lights of the ballroom. After a moment he gave a small nod. "The music is still loud," he said softly. Adrian nodded with understanding. "All right. Let us go there for a bit." As they began walking slowly toward the terrace, Naomi stepped aside to give them space. Ethan passed beside her and paused briefly, looking up at her with the same thoughtful curiosity he had shown earlier. Naomi smiled gently. "That was a wonderful dance," she said again in the same warm tone. Ethan looked down for a moment and then spoke quietly. "You danced like the music was not loud." Naomi's smile grew slightly. "Sometimes if you move slowly the music feels quieter," she said. Ethan seemed to think about that as he followed his father toward the terrace doors. Adrian paused before stepping outside and turned back toward Naomi. For a brief moment the powerful man simply studied her, as though trying to understand how someone he had barely noticed earlier in the evening had changed the course of the entire night. There was no arrogance in his expression now. Only careful consideration. "You have worked here how long, Naomi?" he asked. 6 months, sir," she replied calmly. Adrian nodded once, absorbing the information. Then he said something that caused several nearby guests to glance toward them with surprise. "You will join us on the terrace for a few minutes." Naomi hesitated slightly, aware of the attention around them. "Sir, I should return to my duties." Adrian shook his head gently. "Your duty tonight has already been fulfilled better than anyone else in this room. Please." Ethan had stopped walking and was now looking back toward Naomi as well, waiting quietly. Naomi understood that refusing again might make the moment uncomfortable for the boy who had just begun to feel at ease. So she nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir." The three of them stepped through the tall glass doors onto the terrace where the night air felt cool and calm compared to the warmth of the ballroom. Soft lantern lights lined the stone railing, and beyond them the city stretched into the distance with thousands of quiet lights scattered across the horizon. The sounds of the party faded into a gentle background murmur. Ethan immediately seemed more relaxed. He walked toward the railing and looked out at the view, the soft breeze moving his hair slightly. Adrian watched him carefully, the tension that had lived quietly behind his eyes for years easing just a little. Naomi stood nearby, allowing the quiet moment to unfold without speaking. After a few seconds, Ethan turned back toward her. "The music sounds better out here," he said thoughtfully. Naomi nodded. "Sometimes space makes things easier to hear," she replied. Adrian looked at both of them then, realizing that something important had happened tonight that had nothing to do with business, reputation, or influence. In a house filled with wealth and control, the most valuable thing that had appeared was something far simpler. Understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Adrian Moretti allowed himself to believe that perhaps his son's world did not have to feel so overwhelming after all. The cool night air on the terrace carried the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below, and the quiet hum of the distant city stretched across the horizon like a blanket of soft lights. Ethan Moretti leaned lightly against the stone railing, his small hands resting on the smooth surface as he looked out at the glowing skyline. From here the music inside the ballroom sounded different. The rhythm was softer, the notes drifting through the open doors in gentle waves that no longer crowded his senses. Naomi Carter stood a few steps behind him, allowing the quiet space to settle naturally while Adrian Moretti watched his son with the careful attention of a man who had spent years learning how to read even the smallest shifts in the boy's behavior. Ethan's shoulders had lowered now, the tightness that once held them high slowly fading as the night breeze moved around him. For several seconds none of them spoke. The moment felt too peaceful to interrupt too quickly. Finally Ethan turned slightly and looked back toward Naomi. "The lights out here move slowly," he said thoughtfully. Naomi followed his gaze toward the distant buildings blinking gently in the darkness. "Yes," she said softly. "They do." Ethan seemed to consider that for a moment before asking another quiet question. "When you danced, how did you know the music would not feel loud to me?" Naomi smiled faintly, though her eyes carried a deeper memory. "I did not know for sure," she answered honestly. "But I thought it might help if someone moved with the rhythm instead of asking you to move with everyone else." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the idea. Adrian listened carefully to the exchange. The simplicity of Naomi's answer stayed with him for a moment before he spoke. "You have experience with children like Ethan," he said, his voice calm but curious. Naomi hesitated briefly, not out of discomfort but out of respect for the quiet honesty of the question. "I had a younger brother," she said gently. "His name was Marcus. He used to say that crowded rooms felt like too many radios playing at the same time." Ethan turned toward her more fully now, clearly interested in the comparison. "That is what it feels like sometimes," he said. Naomi nodded with understanding. "Marcus used to find his own rhythm when that happened. Sometimes he would tap his hands on the table or sway with the music the way you did tonight." Ethan looked down at his shoes again, remembering the moment on the dance floor. Adrian remained silent for a moment as he absorbed the story. "Where is your brother now?" he asked quietly. Naomi's expression softened with a calm acceptance that comes from time rather than sadness. "He passed away several years ago," she said. "But he taught me how to listen carefully when someone feels overwhelmed by the world around them." The terrace grew quiet again, but the silence felt warm rather than heavy. Ethan looked toward the city lights once more before speaking again in the same thoughtful tone. "Marcus would have liked that music tonight." Naomi smiled gently. "I think he would have." Adrian rested his hands lightly on the stone railing beside his son. The cool surface felt steady beneath his palms as he looked out across the city. For years he had built his life on decisions made with precision and strategy. Yet the most meaningful moment of the evening had come from something far simpler. Kindness that was patient enough to notice what others overlooked. Ethan shifted slightly and then spoke again. "The music inside is starting again," he said, listening carefully as the orchestra began another slow melody beyond the glass doors. Naomi tilted her head toward the sound. "It sounds like a calm one," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Maybe later I will dance again." Adrian looked down at him, surprised by the quiet confidence in the boy's voice. "I would like to see that," he said warmly. Ethan glanced toward Naomi. "Would you dance again too?" Naomi felt the gentle weight of the question and nodded. "If you want to," she replied. Ethan looked satisfied with that answer and returned his attention to the skyline. Adrian watched the exchange carefully, a realization forming slowly in his mind. In all the time he had spent trying to help his son navigate the world, he had focused on solutions, plans, and expertise. Yet tonight the key had been something far simpler. Someone willing to meet Ethan exactly where he was and move with him instead of asking him to change. As the music continued drifting through the open doors behind them, Adrian Moretti understood that the quiet moment on this terrace might mark the beginning of something new not only for his son but for the way he himself understood the meaning of strength. The night air continued to move softly across the terrace, carrying the distant hum of the city while the music from inside the ballroom flowed through the open doors like a calm current. Ethan Moretti remained near the stone railing, his eyes moving slowly across the skyline as if each cluster of lights held its own quiet pattern. Naomi Carter stood nearby, her posture relaxed, allowing the peaceful moment to exist without rushing it forward. Adrian Moretti watched both of them carefully, noticing how different Ethan looked compared to earlier in the evening. The tightness that had once lived in the boy's shoulders was gone now. In its place was a calm attentiveness that Adrian rarely saw in crowded settings. After a minute Ethan turned back toward the ballroom doors where the soft glow of chandeliers spilled onto the terrace floor. The music had changed again, this time into a gentle piano melody that carried a slower, thoughtful rhythm. Ethan listened closely, tilting his head the way he often did when studying a sound. "That one is softer than the others," he said quietly. Naomi followed his gaze toward the open doors. "Yes," she replied. "Sometimes the musicians choose calmer songs later in the evening." Ethan seemed to think about that, then glanced back toward the ballroom as if measuring the distance between the quiet terrace and the bright floor inside. Adrian noticed the look immediately. "You are thinking about the dance again," he said gently. Ethan nodded once, though there was still a hint of hesitation in the movement. "The room is still big," he said slowly. Naomi stepped a little closer, careful to keep her voice calm and steady. "We do not have to go all the way into the center," she said. "Sometimes dancing works best when you stay near the edge where the music feels comfortable." Ethan considered that suggestion carefully. Adrian watched the quiet exchange with growing curiosity. For years he had heard professionals explain ways to help Ethan manage crowded environments, but the clarity of Naomi's simple approach felt different. She was not giving instructions or corrections. She was giving permission for Ethan to move through the moment at his own pace. Ethan took a slow breath and looked again at the ballroom. The piano melody continued drifting outward, its notes soft and even like footsteps across calm water. After a moment he spoke again. "Maybe we could stand near the door," he said. Naomi smiled gently. "That sounds like a good idea." Adrian stepped aside, allowing Ethan to lead the way. The boy walked slowly back toward the open doors, pausing briefly at the threshold where the terrace ended and the polished marble floor of the ballroom began. The difference in sound was immediate. Inside the music carried more presence, the notes echoing lightly through the tall ceiling, but it was still far gentler than the earlier songs had been. Several guests noticed Ethan returning and watched with quiet interest, though this time their attention felt different. Instead of curiosity mixed with uncertainty, many of them seemed simply patient, giving the boy space. Naomi stepped beside Ethan again, mirroring the same calm presence she had shown earlier. They did not move to the center of the dance floor. Instead they remained near the doorway where the terrace air still softened the sound. Ethan listened for a few seconds, then slowly began to sway again, his shoulders moving lightly with the rhythm of the piano. Naomi matched the motion without speaking. Adrian remained a few steps behind them, observing carefully. The room had changed more than he realized. A couple dancing nearby slowed their steps slightly so they would not crowd the space. The orchestra continued playing with quiet elegance, unaware that the simple melody had once again become part of something far more meaningful than background music. Ethan lifted one hand and traced the rhythm in the air the same way he had done before. Naomi followed the movement, allowing him to guide the pace. This time the boy's confidence was easier to see. He took a small step to the side, then another, his shoes sliding softly across the marble as the piano notes drifted through the room. Naomi moved with him, steady and patient. Across the ballroom several guests watched the quiet scene with gentle smiles. Adrian felt something settle inside his chest as he realized that the evening had shifted completely from what he had originally planned. It was no longer about speeches, introductions, or business conversations. Instead, it had become a moment where a young boy discovered that the world around him could feel welcoming rather than overwhelming. Ethan turned slightly in a small circle again, just as he had done earlier, and when he looked up this time his smile stayed a little longer. Naomi nodded approvingly. "The music likes the way you move," she said softly. Ethan looked toward his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. For the second time that evening the quiet dance continued, not because anyone had asked for it, but because one small act of understanding had shown Ethan that sometimes the world could learn his rhythm too. The gentle piano melody continued to drift through the ballroom, each note soft and steady as though the musicians themselves sensed the calm that had settled over the room. Near the open terrace doors Ethan Moretti moved again in the same careful rhythm he had discovered earlier, his steps light and deliberate as he followed the quiet structure of the music. Naomi Carter mirrored his movements with the same patient precision, never leading too quickly, never stepping ahead of the pace he chose. Around them the guests watched with quiet respect. No one crowded the space. No one interrupted. Instead the crowd seemed to move around the small circle of calm the boy had created, like water flowing gently around a stone in the middle of a stream. Adrian Moretti stood a few feet away, observing the moment with the thoughtful stillness of someone who understood that something fragile and meaningful was unfolding. For years he had seen Ethan retreat when attention gathered around him, but tonight was different. The boy's shoulders were relaxed, his breathing even, and every step he took seemed guided not by pressure but by curiosity. Ethan lifted his hand again, tracing the rhythm of the piano melody in the air before taking a slow turn that carried him slightly farther onto the marble floor. Naomi followed without hesitation, allowing the movement to feel natural rather than rehearsed. A soft murmur passed through the nearby guests as they realized the boy had stepped farther into the room than he had earlier. Still, the crowd remained respectful. A couple dancing nearby slowed their steps, giving Ethan and Naomi even more space. The piano melody continued its gentle flow while the lights from the chandeliers shimmered across the polished floor beneath their feet. Ethan paused for a moment, listening carefully as the song shifted into a slightly brighter sequence of notes. Then he looked toward Naomi with thoughtful concentration. "The song changed a little," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sometimes songs do that in the middle." Ethan studied the sound again and then took 2 small steps in a different direction, adjusting his movement to match the new rhythm. Naomi smiled softly and matched the change immediately. Adrian noticed the shift and felt a quiet amazement settle in his chest. Ethan was not just reacting anymore. He was exploring the music, discovering how it moved and allowing his body to follow. The confidence in the boy's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Several guests nearby began to smile as well, their attention drawn to the calm determination Ethan displayed. One older man standing near the bar whispered to his wife that the boy seemed completely different from earlier in the evening. His wife nodded in quiet agreement, her eyes warm with admiration. Ethan turned again, completing another slow circle, and this time his smile remained longer. Naomi lowered her hand slightly, allowing him to lead the next movement entirely on his own. Ethan took another step, then another, his shoes gliding across the marble floor in soft, careful motions that followed the rhythm perfectly. When the melody softened again he slowed with it, swaying gently as though he and the music had become part of the same quiet conversation. Adrian stepped forward slightly, though he kept enough distance so Ethan would not feel watched too closely. The powerful man's expression remained calm, but his eyes carried something new. Pride. Not the loud kind that comes from achievements or recognition, but the quiet pride of seeing a child find confidence in his own way. The orchestra reached the final notes of the song and allowed the melody to fade slowly into silence. Ethan stopped moving and looked up, breathing evenly, his face relaxed in a way that had been rare earlier in the evening. Naomi gave him a gentle nod. "That was even better than the first one," she said softly. Ethan looked toward his father again. Adrian smiled, a rare expression that softened the strong lines of his face. "You did well," he said simply. Ethan's smile widened just a little, and for a moment he stood comfortably in the middle of the ballroom without any sign of the hesitation that had once kept him near the walls. The room remained quiet for another second before conversation slowly resumed around them. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. The guests no longer saw Ethan as the boy who stood apart from the crowd. Instead they saw the child who had just shown them that confidence sometimes grows in the quietest ways. And as Adrian watched Naomi standing beside his son, he understood that the evening had become something far more meaningful than the event he had originally planned. One small act of patience had opened a door that years of effort had never quite reached, and the rhythm of a simple piano melody had allowed Ethan to step through it. For a few quiet seconds after the music ended, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The last note of the piano faded into the high ceiling, leaving behind a gentle stillness that felt almost intentional. Ethan Moretti stood at the edge of the dance floor, his small chest rising and falling calmly as he looked around the room that only an hour earlier had felt too loud, too crowded, too overwhelming. Now the same space felt different. The lights were still bright, the guests were still elegant, the orchestra was still preparing their next piece, but something about the atmosphere had softened. Naomi Carter remained beside him, steady and quiet, her presence the same calm anchor that had guided him through the music. Adrian Moretti stepped closer now, the polished leather of his shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. When Ethan noticed his father approaching, he looked up with a cautious expression that quickly relaxed when Adrian gave him a warm nod. "You did something very brave tonight," Adrian said gently. Ethan blinked at the word brave, as if turning it over in his mind. "I just followed the music," he replied softly. Naomi smiled at that. "Sometimes that is exactly what bravery looks like," she said. Around them the guests slowly resumed their conversations, but the tone of the room had changed. Earlier there had been polite curiosity when people glanced at Ethan. Now there was something closer to admiration. A few guests offered quiet smiles as they passed by, careful not to draw too much attention but clearly moved by what they had witnessed. Near the orchestra, a violinist adjusted her sheet music and whispered something to the pianist, both of them glancing toward the young boy with gentle respect before preparing the next song. Ethan noticed the movement and tilted his head slightly. "Are they going to play another one?" he asked. Adrian nodded. "They usually play several more before the evening ends." Ethan considered that for a moment. Then he looked toward Naomi again. "Would it be all right if we listened for a little while before dancing again?" he asked carefully. Naomi nodded. "That sounds like a good plan." Adrian placed a light hand on Ethan's shoulder once more. "How about we sit near the terrace doors where the music still sounds soft?" he suggested. Ethan agreed with a small nod, and the three of them moved slowly toward a nearby seating area where a pair of elegant chairs faced the dance floor. The chairs were upholstered in deep blue fabric that reflected the warm chandelier light above. Ethan sat down carefully and watched the orchestra begin their next melody, this time a gentle instrumental version of an old American standard that floated through the room with quiet grace. Naomi remained standing beside the chairs at first, but Adrian gestured toward the empty seat nearby. "Please sit," he said politely. Naomi hesitated for a moment, aware of the formal nature of the event and her place among the staff, but Adrian's expression carried genuine respect rather than expectation. She nodded and took the seat. For a while none of them spoke. Ethan listened to the music with focused attention, his foot tapping lightly against the floor in a rhythm that matched the melody. Adrian studied his son quietly, noticing the peaceful concentration on the boy's face. Then Adrian turned slightly toward Naomi. You said earlier that your brother Marcus used music to find his rhythm when the world felt too loud, he said. Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. Adrian looked toward the orchestra thoughtfully. It seems Ethan has found something similar tonight. Naomi followed his gaze. Music can be a safe place when someone understands how to listen to it, she said gently. Ethan heard that and looked up again. It is easier when someone listens with you, he added. Naomi smiled. Yes, it is. Adrian felt the truth of that statement settle deeply within him. For years he had tried to protect Ethan from a world that often moved too quickly for him, but tonight had shown him something different. Sometimes what a child needed most was not protection from the world, but a companion willing to walk through it at the same pace. As the orchestra continued playing and the warm light of the chandeliers shimmered across the ballroom floor, Adrian Moretti realized that the most powerful moment of the evening had not come from the speeches, the business conversations, or the carefully planned introductions. It had come from a simple invitation to dance and the patience to move slowly enough for a young boy to discover his own confidence. The gentle instrumental melody continued to float through the ballroom as Ethan Moretti sat quietly in the blue upholstered chair near the terrace doors, his foot tapping lightly in rhythm with the music. The glow of the chandeliers reflected softly across the polished marble floor while the orchestra moved gracefully through the song, each note rising and falling with calm precision. Naomi Carter sat nearby, her posture relaxed yet attentive, while Adrian Moretti observed his son with the quiet focus of a man who understood that something important had begun to shift. Ethan had not retreated into silence again as he often did after moments of attention. Instead he remained calm, listening carefully to the music as if the melody itself had created a safe space around him. After a minute he leaned forward slightly and looked toward the dance floor where several couples were moving slowly together. Their steps were smooth and elegant, but Ethan's attention was not fixed on their technique. He seemed more interested in the rhythm itself, the way the music guided their movements without forcing them. Naomi noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. Are you studying the rhythm again? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. The piano part is slower than before, he said. Naomi listened carefully for a moment and smiled gently. You are right. The pianist is playing more slowly now. That can make dancing feel easier. Ethan considered that information carefully, then glanced toward his father. Adrian gave him a warm nod that carried quiet encouragement. If you want to stand again, you can, Adrian said calmly. There is no hurry. Ethan took a small breath and slid down from the chair. He did not rush toward the dance floor this time. Instead he stepped carefully onto the marble floor and paused, listening again to the melody before moving. Naomi rose as well but remained a step behind him so that the moment belonged to Ethan rather than to her guidance. Slowly he began to sway again, his shoulders moving lightly with the rhythm. The music was gentle, and his movements reflected that softness. Around them the guests continued enjoying the evening, but several people noticed Ethan standing again and watched with quiet admiration. A man near the bar whispered to his companion that the boy seemed much more confident now. His companion nodded in agreement, her expression warm. Naomi stepped forward only when Ethan lifted his hand slightly, repeating the small gesture he had used earlier to trace the music in the air. She mirrored the movement again, allowing the rhythm to connect them without words. Adrian watched carefully from a few feet away, recognizing how naturally the moment unfolded when Ethan was allowed to move at his own pace. For a few minutes the gentle dance continued. It was not a performance meant to impress the room. It was simply a quiet exchange between a child discovering his comfort and a woman patient enough to meet him there. When the orchestra reached the final notes of the melody and allowed the music to fade again, Ethan stopped moving and looked toward Naomi with a thoughtful expression. The music feels friendlier tonight, he said. Naomi smiled. Sometimes it only needs the right moment to sound that way. Adrian stepped forward then, placing a light hand on Ethan's shoulder. You handled the evening very well, he said warmly. Ethan nodded, accepting the compliment without embarrassment. Then he looked toward Naomi again. Thank you for dancing with me, he said quietly. Naomi's voice remained gentle. "Thank you for showing me your rhythm." Adrian studied the two of them for a moment before speaking again, his tone calm but sincere. "Naomi, you helped Ethan feel comfortable in a room where he often struggles. That is something I will not forget." Naomi inclined her head respectfully. "I am glad he enjoyed the music tonight," she replied. Ethan glanced between them and then toward the orchestra as the musicians prepared their next song. The night was still continuing, the ballroom still full of soft light and quiet conversation. Yet for Adrian Moretti, the most meaningful moment of the evening had already arrived. Watching his son stand calmly among the guests, no longer overwhelmed by the room around him, Adrian understood that confidence sometimes begins with the smallest gesture of understanding. And tonight that gesture had come from someone who simply noticed a child standing alone and chose to listen to the rhythm with him instead of asking him to change it. The orchestra began one final melody for the evening, a slow and warm arrangement that drifted across the ballroom like a gentle breeze through an open window. The chandeliers above continued to glow softly, casting golden reflections across the polished marble floor while conversations moved quietly around the room. Yet for Adrian Moretti, the noise of the evening had faded into something distant. His attention remained focused on Ethan. The boy stood calmly near the edge of the dance floor now, no longer searching for a wall to lean against, no longer twisting the sleeve of his jacket in quiet anxiety. Instead he watched the musicians with thoughtful curiosity, his body moving lightly with the rhythm as if the music had finally become something welcoming rather than overwhelming. Naomi Carter stood beside him with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning of the night, her movements unhurried and her voice gentle whenever Ethan spoke. For a moment Ethan listened carefully to the melody before turning toward Naomi again. "This one sounds like it is saying goodbye," he said quietly. Naomi tilted her head and listened to the music herself. The slow piano notes and soft strings carried a feeling of quiet closure, the kind musicians often chose near the end of an evening. "You might be right," she said with a warm smile. "Sometimes the last song feels like that." Ethan nodded slowly, then looked toward his father. Adrian met his son's gaze with calm encouragement. "Would you like to dance one more time before the night ends?" he asked gently. Ethan hesitated only for a second before nodding. Naomi stepped forward again, allowing Ethan to guide the rhythm the way he had earlier. The boy lifted his hand slightly and began to sway with the music, his movements calm and natural. Naomi followed the same quiet pattern, matching his pace without speaking. Around them the ballroom continued its soft activity, but the people nearest the dance floor noticed the moment and slowed their steps again. Several guests who had been preparing to leave paused briefly to watch. There was something peaceful about the small dance unfolding before them, something that reminded them that confidence sometimes grows in the most unexpected ways. Ethan took a slow turn and then another, the gentle melody guiding each movement. This time he did not glance nervously around the room. Instead he focused entirely on the rhythm, his face calm and quietly proud. Naomi mirrored the movement again, letting him lead the moment completely. Adrian stood nearby with his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching his son move with a confidence he had rarely seen before. The orchestra carried the melody through its final notes, the music softening gradually until the last piano chord lingered in the air. Ethan slowed to a stop, breathing evenly as the sound faded. Naomi gave him a warm nod. "That might be the best dance of the night," she said gently. Ethan looked toward his father again. Adrian smiled, a genuine expression that softened the strength of his features. "I think you are right," he replied. The guests nearby offered a quiet round of applause, not loud or overwhelming but respectful and warm. Ethan looked slightly surprised by the sound, then smiled shyly before stepping back beside Naomi. Adrian approached them both, his voice calm but sincere. "Ethan, I am very proud of you tonight." The boy nodded, accepting the words quietly. Then Adrian turned toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said thoughtfully, "I believe tonight you gave my son something that no expert or plan has been able to give him before." Naomi looked slightly surprised by the statement but remained composed. "I only listened to the music with him," she replied gently. Adrian nodded slowly. Sometimes that is exactly what someone needs. He looked toward Ethan again, watching the calm confidence that now rested in the boy's posture. Then Adrian spoke with quiet certainty. Naomi, beginning tomorrow I would like you to spend more time with Ethan during the day. Not as staff serving the house, but as someone he can trust to help him find that rhythm again whenever the world feels too loud. Naomi paused for a moment, touched by the sincerity of the request. If Ethan would like that, I would be honored, she answered softly. Ethan looked up at her and nodded without hesitation. I would like that, he said. The evening began to wind down as guests slowly moved toward the exit, their conversations warm and reflective. Yet the most meaningful part of the night had already happened. In a room filled with influence, wealth, and carefully planned conversations, the moment that truly mattered had been something simple. A child who once stood alone by the wall had stepped into the music. And someone kind enough to notice had walked beside him until he realized the rhythm had been waiting for him all along.